A good comic book story has conflict, hero, villain, saving someone usually.
You know what it is? A good comic book story has what any good adventure story has, except it's illustrated. That's all. But it has to have all the elements. Good characterization, believable dialogue, and exciting situations that make you want to go to the next
Believable dialogue, zap, bam, whap.
No, those are sound effects, you silly person. That's not the dialogue. The dialogue has to
I've come to save you.
It has to be like you and me talking. Well, it can't be that brilliant, but it has to be something like that.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shana, and this is the American English Podcast. My goal here is to teach you the English spoken in the United States through common expressions, pronunciation tips, and interesting cultural snippets or stories. I hope to keep this fun, useful, and interesting. Let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Let me ask you a few questions. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Would you choose to be able to fly? Would you have X-ray vision? Would you want to be able to become invisible? In today's fun fact, we're going to be talking about Stan Lee, the brain behind some of the most beloved and despised superheroes and villains in comic book history. In that introduction, you heard Stan Lee as he spoke about what makes a good comic. The snippet was taken from the YouTube channel Media Collection in a video titled Stan Lee Interview Collection. In that interview, I also learned that as of the year 2000, 95% of readership of action comic books were male. For all of the female listeners out there, I'd just like to say, stay tuned even if you don't like comic books or comic book characters. Apart from hearing how he came up with some of these iconic characters, you'll hear Stan's life story and how he molded international comic book history. It's by far one of the most interesting podcasts I've researched, mostly because he's such a cool person. So stay tuned. Before we get to the second part of this episode, we'll begin with a joke, I'll teach an expression, and we'll do some pronunciation exercises. Actually, the joke is sort of a riddle. Are you ready for it? Why is Spider-Man better than Superman? Any ideas? Because he can shoot webs and Clark Kent. I read about 10 jokes to Lucas, and he chose this one, I think because he understood it without me having to explain it. For those of you who aren't aware, Clark Kent is the man behind Superman's costume. When spoken quickly, Clark's last name, Kent, sounds a bit like can't, right? So let's hear that joke one more time. Why is Spider-Man better than Superman? Because he can shoot webs and Clark Kent. All right, hope you enjoyed that joke. Today, the expression is going to be an easy one, and it's very common. It's on the edge of one's seat. As usual, let's go through the individual words first. On is a preposition. My phone is currently on the table next to me. It is physically touching the table and being supported by the table from below. The is a definitive article. I live in the house, not the apartment. So I get the idea that there's a specific house and a specific apartment that I'm talking about. Edge is a border. It's the outside limit of an object, area, or surface, according to Oxford English Dictionary. Of is a preposition, and it refers to an individual part of a whole. For example, in this expression, the edge is part of the seat. One's is belonging to or relating to people. Here, of course, we're talking about an individual's seat, which is the bottom part of a chair, couch, or other surface that we sit on. In a car, there are front seats and back seats. For babies, there are car seats, right? The list goes on. In English, we say that we are on the edge of our seat when something is so exciting we can't stop paying attention. You're so eager to see what will happen that you quite literally might be sitting at the front of your chair or on the edge of your seat. When you're watching a good movie, for example, you might be on the edge of your seat. You're completely engaged in the film. You want to know what will happen. Let's go through some more examples to make more sense of this. Example number 1. When I was in 4th grade, everyone in my class started reading Harry Potter. The release of the first book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, really coincided with the time in our lives that we started reading longer chapter books. Harry was also relatable to us, most of us being around 10 or 11 years old at the time, and that was the same age Harry was when he found out he was a wizard in the first book. The fact is, Harry Potter books are full of adventure and surprising twists, so I remember everyone was on the edge of their seats, eager to know what would happen at the end of the story. In other words, everyone was very anxious to know what would happen. Example number 2. For the past week and a half, I've had very bad contractions. I told my good friend Nina about the labor scares, and over the past few weeks, she's been very curious about my state. She's been keeping tabs on me. She sent me a few long messages on WhatsApp that I didn't manage to respond to quickly, and in her mind, I'd gone into labor. When I finally wrote back, I found out that she had been on the edge of her seat waiting to hear news from me. In other words, she was very eager and excited to see what was happening, and she kept checking her phone to see if I'd responded. So she was on the edge of her seat waiting. Example number 3. Let's imagine that the coronavirus is over. Woohoo! And life goes back to normal. The movie theaters are finally open and a new Pixar movie comes out. You take a group of about 10 kids to watch it. In that situation, I guarantee that regardless of the quality of the film, they'll be on the edge of their seats throughout the duration of the movie. In other words, they'll pay extra close attention and be very enthusiastic to see what happens next. Why? Because going to the movies will, of course, be a novelty once again. Let's move on to the pronunciation exercises. We'll start with the statement, "That intro had me on the edge of my seat." Repeat after me. That intro. That intro had me. That intro had me on the. That intro had me on the edge of my seat. That intro had me on the edge of my seat. And the conjugation, I was on the edge of my seat. You were on the edge of your seat. He was on the edge of his seat. She was on the edge of her seat. It was on the edge of its seat. We were on the edge of our seats. They were on the edge of their seats. That's it for the pronunciation exercise. Let's move on to the very interesting life story of Stan Lee, who was born with the name Stanley Lieber. Stanley Lieber was born in New York City on December 28, 1922. His parents were Romanian, having immigrated to the U.S. shortly before his birth in search of opportunity. Back in those days, there was a lot of talk about the American dream. You could come to the U.S. and turn your life around. If you felt like a nobody back home, you could become a somebody, however difficult your situation may be. Success and a nice house with a picket fence were just around the corner. At least that was the idea of the American dream. And no doubt about it, the early 20s were a wonderful time to be in the U.S. For the first 6 years of Stanley's life, New York City was a pretty okay place to be. His family had an apartment, and while his father earned wages at a fabric cutting company, his mom Celia stayed home to take care of Stan. When the stock market crashed in 1929, everything changed. That was the beginning of the Great Depression, a time of intense economic struggle for many families across the U.S., including the Liebers. When Stan's father lost his job, they had to downsize from their already small apartment to one the size of a shoebox in order to make ends meet. Stan said that his parents slept on a fold-out couch they shared in the living room, while Stan and his brother Larry shared the bedroom. The hardship within the household was really a blessing in disguise. Celia put a lot of pressure on Stan to succeed. Good grades for her meant a good job and a good income to support the family. From a young age, he started picking up part-time gigs here and there to pay for the small expenses he had. He worked as an usher at the movies. He delivered sandwiches. He was an office boy for a trouser manufacturer. The list goes on. One of his favorite activities he saved up for was going to the movies. When Stan was just a kid, he was greatly inspired by Errol Flynn, the actor who played Robin Hood and other characters who rescued women from dangerous situations. He claimed in an interview, "I used to leave the theater with an imaginary sword looking for women to rescue. I can think of nothing more fun than spending your life rescuing women." He knew at that point that at one point in his life, he wanted to be an actor. At school, Stan was a natural learner and dedicated student. In fact, he was bumped up a few grades. Being the youngest in his class, he often found it hard to make friends, and soon found refuge in books and drawing. In summertime, when the little boys and girls went off to summer camp, Stan stayed home and read. His parents couldn't afford summer camp like other families. However, they could support his ever-growing book collection. His mom even let him read books while at the dinner table, which by the age of 9 became a routine for him. The Hardy Boys were his favorite. These were fictional mysteries with adventure and discovery and crime. Over time, he discovered H.G. Wells, the British author who was often called the father of science fiction, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and Mark Twain, who's responsible for the great American classics Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Writing became a hobby of his. Like his literary idols, he would write the way that people talked. He always looked for a good story and a relatable one. His favorite teacher, Mr. Ginsberg, had taught him that a lesson can always be learned if it's explained with a bit of humor and a story. This was a tip that Stan took and implemented into his writing. In his early teens, he entered writing competitions sponsored by the New York Herald Tribune. According to the book Stan Lee by Jeff Edgers, quote, Stan won so many times the newspaper asked him to stop entering. His talent was unmatched, and they thought that other, less talented writers deserved a shot at winning the prizes as well. At age 16, in 1939, Stan graduated from high school and started to look for a job. He got into comic books by accident when he stumbled upon a job opening in magazine management. He didn't know that he would actually be working in the comics department. So he scored the job at Timely Comics and started working on a team with just 2 other men. Joe did most of the writing, Jack did most of the illustration, and Stan was responsible for filling ink pots, grabbing coffee, and running errands. In fact, Joe commented on the fact that Stan would bring a recorder to the office and would sit in the corner tooting away while they worked. It was the golden age of comics then. DC comics were becoming popular with Superman and Batman. In response, Joe and Jack created the Human Torch, who originally was an android who could burst into flames and control criminals. They also created the Submariner, Namor, who had superhuman strength, speed, flight, and even superhuman vision to see in poor water conditions. Real success came with Captain America, who was created right when World War II started to rage in Europe. Up until that point, Stan hadn't written or drawn anything at work, but his big break was about to come. Within each comic book, there were about 2 pages that nobody really read, or at least that's what Joe Simon claimed. One day, Joe passed those 2 pages over to Stan, who was ecstatic. He saw the task as his first real writing job. After the publication, he was asked to do more and more. He needed a pen name, and he decided on Stan Lee, which was the first half of his first name, Stanley, and the first half of his last name, Lieber. He joked that he was saving his real name, Stanley Martin Lieber, for his future career as a novelist. For one reason or another, In time, Joe and Jack quit the company, and Stan was the only man left in the department. Mr. Goodman, who was the boss, had him take over writing for Captain America. He was only 18 at the time. And although Goodman claimed the work would be temporary, nobody else was hired. Soon enough, Stan was writing for other genres as well, romances, westerns, crimes, whatever it may be. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. decided to join World War II in Europe. Stan felt it was his duty to be there with other American men his age, and so he enlisted. He had already become a well-established writer by the time, and so he was assigned a military role as playwright. This was incredibly rare. Instead of bearing a weapon, he was given a pen and paper, and he went about writing military guides and making training films for the U.S. government. There were a few other authors with him, including Theodore Geisel, who is more popularly known as Dr. Seuss, and Frank Capra, just to name a few. While working for the government, he continued to send stories to Timely, many of which showcased Captain America, the Torch, or Timely's other early characters, and they would all take on the Nazis. The comics became politically fueled, with good triumphing over evil, and readers ate it up. When he got back to New York, he started back up at the studio at Timely. That's also when his love life took a turn. He was 23 when he met Joni, a British woman who had settled in New York City to model hats. She was not just stunning, she was lively and charismatic, just like him. In interviews, Stan said that she had the face he'd always drawn. For him, she was the character that superheroes saved. For him, it was love at first sight. In fact, he was so enthralled by her that he vaguely remembers telling her he loved her the same day they met. Fortunately, the feeling was mutual. They got hitched in Reno in December of 1947, and just a few years later, Joan Celia, their daughter, was born. Like many growing families in New York, the Liebers decided to get a house in the suburbs. Long Island became their new stomping ground, and Stan could work from home as he liked, as long as he kept writing stories. So instead of a stuffy room in the Empire State Building in Manhattan, his backyard became his office. He'd read his scripts out loud as he worked, often yelling characters' lines and sound effects to ensure they sounded right. Comics had been doing well, that is, until about 1948, when parents started voicing their concerns about the negative influence comic books had on children. They were too violent, too cruel. There was too much sexual perversion. At that time, comic book burnings were hosted in lots of different cities around the U.S. To add fuel to the fire, a psychologist named Dr. Wortham published articles and books that supported such claims. He claimed that comic books were in fact the reason why children became juvenile delinquents. A juvenile delinquent is a young person who commits crimes every now and then. Wortham interviewed 100 delinquents, from which the majority claimed to have read comic books at one point in their lives. For him, that was enough information to conclude that it was the comic books that were the culprit. Exposure to them caused illegal behavior. He sympathized with parents, ensuring them that their kids' behavior wasn't their fault. And since he was a published doctor, many adults bought into it. He also led parents to believe that comic books caused asthma. If your kids were cooped up inside reading comics, they wouldn't be outside with other kids getting fresh air. Soon after, congressional meetings were held about banning comic books altogether. Dr. Wortham's claims and federal government meetings were making headlines. And because of that, comic book companies went bankrupt. Timely, where Stan worked, fortunately did not, and they were part of a resolution. Instead of banning comic books, Comics Magazine Association of America came up with a solution that would appease parents and the government. They created what was called the Comics Code Authority. They'd self-regulate and censor all new comic books. Any comic book released would have a seal of approval on the cover if they followed specific guidelines. First of all, they needed to respect established authority, and that included policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions. Also, good had to triumph over evil. No police officer should die because of a criminal. No innocent people should die either. Thirdly, love stories needed to show the sanctity of marriage. And last but not least, straight out, no vampires, ghouls, werewolves, or zombies were allowed. Naturally, being a writer or an illustrator of comics didn't have the pizzazz it did in the late 30s and 40s. Censorship curbed creativity in such a way that sales for many companies plummeted, and they felt they couldn't do much about it. Distributors would refuse to sell comic books without the seals. At the same time, in the 1950s, television was becoming popular. It seemed like kids were losing interest in comics altogether. Stan was ready to quit. The thing is, his wife planted an idea in his head. If he was going to quit, why not create a comic book exactly the way he wanted it? If it failed, no big deal. He was going to quit anyway. DC Comics was one of the only companies who didn't seem to be suffering back then. They had come out with the Justice League. Unlike ever before in history, superheroes were fighting together. So Stan asked himself, if DC has Superman and Wonder Woman, Batman and Aquaman, the Green Lantern and the Martian Manhunter, what sorts of characters could I create that would be different and also competition? The answer was easy. He thought back to the days of his teacher, Mr. Ginsberg. You can teach a lesson through a story that has humor. He'd make characters that people of all ages, not just kids, could relate to, and he'd have them be in New York City, the city he knew like the back of his hand. So that's when Marvel Comics made its debut. In 1961, the Fantastic Four came out, and it was a huge success. Shortly afterwards, Ant-Man and the Hulk, based on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Then there was Spider-Man, which he created after seeing a fly flying around the wall. He thought, wouldn't it be cool if a superhero could stick to walls? Then came Iron Man, the Silver Surfer, and the Black Panther. Later on, Blade and Wolverine, the X-Men characters. These characters had flaws. They struggled with self-doubt and fear. When trying to ask girls out on dates, they'd be extra concerned about the way they looked and sounded. They had everyday concerns also. Were they going to be able to pay rent? Would they get good grades on exams? Some of them didn't even like their superpowers and had to find ways to deal with them. Back in the 60s, he also used his characters as a way to address social issues, such as alcoholism, nuclear energy, and persecution. The Black Panther was released during the Civil Rights Movement. He was the first Black superhero. Stan took it upon himself to speak in lots of interviews and at universities. How ironic that was. The children, whose parents forced them to burn comic books when they were young, were actually reconsidering the comic book appeal as adults. He was ready for the next big challenge, bringing comics to TV. And it wasn't that hard, actually. He went to CBS, a broadcasting network, and they picked up Hulk almost immediately. The television show lasted for 5 years with 80 episodes. After TV, the next big challenge was film. In 1978, DC proved it was possible to make comics a box office success when they released Superman, and it made $300 million, the sixth highest grossing movie at the time. Hollywood was open to it. The only problem was creating a reality for superheroes with the technology available at that day and age. When Stan and his family moved out to Hollywood, they realized it was a whole new ballgame. Although he started planning for films to come out in the late 70s, it wasn't until 1998 that the first movie was released, Blade, and it earned $131 million. That was just the tip of the iceberg. In 2000, X-Men came out and earned $200 million. When Spider-Man was released in 2002, everyone waited in line for tickets. It was a huge success, earning $822 million. Then came the Hulk, the Iron Man films, Spider-Man sequels, Thor, and the Avengers. Iron Man 3 hit the billion-dollar mark in 2018. And then afterwards, the Avengers earned $2 billion in worldwide sales. Stan, up until the very end of his life in 2018, was very involved in all aspects of creation. For films, he was the executive producer. With his brother Larry, he continued to make printed Spider-Man comics for newspapers across the US. In his late 80s, he started a YouTube channel. He did voiceover in video games, and he made guest appearances at Comic-Con as well. When attendees knew he'd be there, tickets sold out in seconds. He even managed to score roles as an actor in many of his Marvel movies. He was a hot dog vendor in X-Men, a security guard in the Hulk, a patient in a mental hospital in Thor, and he had many other cameos. At last, he fulfilled his childhood dream of being an actor. Retire, he said, is a dirty word. You know, most people when they retire, they say, at last I'll have a chance to do what I've always wanted to do. But I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. I'm having fun. Stan Lee passed away on November 12th, 2018 at 95 years old. That's it for this episode. I didn't focus on some of the hardships that hit Stan over time. For example, waiting 20 years for a box office success was hard on him. In the 90s, Marvel also went bankrupt. There were frauds and struggles in Hollywood. His partner Jack Kirby had awkward relations with Stan after years working together when he felt like he was cheated out of his credit. But if you watch the documentary on Stan called With Great Power, The Stan Lee Story, Stan openly talks about it and the impact Jack Kirby had on the creation of superheroes. In my personal opinion, Stan was always chosen to be in the spotlight by publications because he's simply such a likable person. I mean, we saw the same issue with Walt Disney and Upton Iwerks in episode number 60. I guess it's always important to remember, one man can't do it all, although one man, if well-spoken and charming, is likely going to be the face of a company. So to wrap this up, I'd like to ask you a question. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Think about it. I couldn't help but think about this the entire time I researched the fun fact. The first thing I thought of was invisibility. How, if I were invisible, I could enter a Lindt chocolate factory without being seen. I'm not sure what I'd do once inside. I guess steal chocolate bars or eat chocolate bars. Not really sure. That was just the first thought. And then I thought, oh, telekinesis, which is the ability to move things from one location to another. So think of Matilda, the great Roald Dahl story. So if I had the power to move things across the room, it'd be very useful. If I left my phone in another room, I'd just summon it to me. If I wanted a cup of coffee, I'd make one while sitting on the couch. I know it seems pretty lazy, but having telekinetic powers right now would be amazing, considering I'm 36 weeks pregnant and can barely move, barely bend. Yeah. Anyway, think about this last question. The question is in the second conditional. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? And the answers also are in the conditional, right? If I had, I'd do. If I left my phone in another room, I would summon it to me. If I had the power to move something, it would be very useful, etc., etc. I know this can be challenging to create if you're not used to talking in conditionals. Hope you're having a nice day, and until next time, bye.